I'm willing to bet that everyone who watches this channel is a nerd and or geek to some extent, so you're probably familiar with fan conventions, or cons. These are events like Comic-Con, AnimeCon, Minecon, and others I won't mention. But you might not know that scientists in various fields have their own sorts of cons, although they usually class themselves up a bit and call them meetings. For paleontology and related sciences like evolution and geology, there's a few options to choose from, and they're usually just referred to by the name of the organization that hosts the events in question. The main one that you might have heard of is the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, or SVP, which usually holds its big annual meetings in October, although this year it's in early November. Every year since 1940, professional scientists, students, and interested layfolk from across the world have been gathering, mostly in the US and Western Europe, to share their latest discoveries and upcoming research with their peers. Of course, travel costs, membership fees, and other barriers to entry, both covert and overt, have historically made this a pretty exclusive event, even among scientists themselves. But thanks to the rise of the internet and social media, it's gotten easier for regular, non-professional folks like you and me to get insights into what's being presented long before it ever hits the presses of scientific journals and news articles. That brings us to the topic of today's quick little video, where I'll go through the newly released SVP 2022 Program Guide, a list of new projects and studies that are slated to be presented in some form or fashion at this year's meeting in Toronto, Canada. There are hundreds, if not thousands of projects listed here, so I'm obviously not going to talk about many of them. These are pretty much just the top few that I personally found the most interesting for one reason or another while skimming the guide. Before we get into it though, there are two massive caveats that are worth addressing. Firstly, these are going to be relatively brief descriptions, not quite the deep dives that I usually prefer to do. This is because these are all just abstracts I'm working from. For the most part, none of this has been published yet, and is likely under embargo. This means that unless you're really close friends with one of these scientists, or know a guy in some Discord server, you shouldn't expect any further details about most of these things until they're officially published, and that could be years from now. Secondly, because most of this stuff hasn't actually been peer-reviewed yet, and in some cases the research isn't even completely finished, any and all of what's covered here is liable to change by the time it ever actually gets properly released. This isn't to cast aspersions on the reliability of the researchers involved or imply that their work is bad, nor does it necessarily mean that the overall conclusions will change, but still, take everything said from here on out with pre-hypertension levels of salt. With that said, let's begin.
Weigeltisaurids Wild Wings.
The gliding lizard-like body plan, where rods of bone fold out from the ribcage, is one that's been done multiple times throughout the history of reptiles. Today, it's represented by the true gliding lizards themselves in the genus Draco. However, the earliest group to do it, called the Weigeltisaurids, arose around 260 million years ago, in the Permian period. Through close examination of remains from Madagascar and Western Europe, this study finds that Weigeltisaurid wings were actually attached to the gastralia, or belly ribs, on the underside of the body, instead of on the top of the ribcage. Using this new information, the study then digitally reconstructed a model of the best preserved and most famous member of the group, Slurosaurovus elevensis, and tested its gliding capabilities. It could in fact glide pretty well, though further details, if any, are pending.
Triassic Archosaurs Ran Hot.
As you might know, red blood cells are pretty important because they transport oxygen throughout your body. What you might not know is that they actually come in different sizes, with smaller cells carrying more oxygen, and more oxygen flowing through a system usually means a higher metabolism. This study looked at cross-sections of bones from a variety of Triassic archosaurs, including early theropod and ornithopod dinosaurs, silosaurids, and the bipedal croc cousins, the poposaurids, and found that they all had small vascular canals running through their bones to help facilitate oxygen transport. This means that all of these animals had high metabolisms and essentially were endothermic, or warm-blooded. Not particularly surprising news if you are familiar with these creatures and how they are clearly built for more active lifestyles, but it's an interesting new method that can be used to help determine animal metabolisms.
Archelosaurs Eye Wipes.
The nictitating membrane is that usually clear flap of skin that you often see wiping across the eyes of various animals, ranging from fish and amphibians to reptiles and certain mammals. Humans actually have a vestigial one. It's that little pink sheet on the inner corner of your eye, and it's kinda sucky that we lost it. A lot of animals use them to protect and/or clean their eyes while still being able to see. This study looked at the muscles that power the nictitating action in turtles, crocodilians, and birds, collectively called the Archelosaurs. In the former two groups, one set of muscles retracts the eye while another set moves the membrane itself. However, the study found that birds have evolved a new strategy for moving the membrane because their eyeballs are too big to be pulled back into their sockets. By comparing the eye size to extinct dinosaurs, it's predicted that early aviolans like Archaeopteryx and Confuciusornis had this similar bird-type system, while other dinosaurs kept the croc-like system.
Rebuilding Brazil's National Museum.
In 2018, federal negligence led to the fire that destroyed much of the Museu Nacional of Brazil, including many unique fossils that have been found in the region. However, this loss hasn't stopped the museum from rebuilding, and this publication, more of a progress report than an actual scientific study, which isn't uncommon at SVP meetings, talks about the processes the museum is going through in constructing new exhibits with the pieces left over, trying to tell a story of life on Earth while also keeping as much of Brazilian natural history involved as possible.
Bones and genomes, making them match.
Figuring out how organisms are related to each other has traditionally relied on the presence of shared physical traits, and to an extent, it's still a pretty heavily relied upon method of constructing family trees, especially when you're dealing with fossil taxa. But in recent decades, with the rise of molecular sequencing, a lot of these morphology-based ideas are being amended, if not completely overturned, revealing surprising connections, or lack thereof, between different groups. Our understanding of the evolutionary relationships among modern birds are one such example of this shift in perspective. Take falcons. For a while, they were commonly thought to be in the same family as other birds of prey like hawks and eagles, which makes sense since they look pretty similar. But in 2008, a molecular study found that they're actually most closely related to parrots and passerines. This new study looks at the phylogenetic tree of birds created by genetic and molecular evidence and tries to see if there are potentially overlooked morphological features that can be used to produce similar trees, which would be useful to anyone trying to incorporate fossil birds into these studies since, of course, they're only known from bones that will likely never get genetic material from.
PalaeoPoems.
This is another one of those science communication projects, so not an actual study here, but just as interesting. Apparently, paleontologists have historically really enjoyed putting their thoughts down in poetry format, so a group of folks have created a digital archive of those works in a program called PalaeoPoems. There are currently 27 poems spanning a wide range of topics and historical time periods, complete with biographies of the authors, links to the relevant science to help contextualize the ideas presented, illustrations of the subjects covered, and voiceover functions for accessibility purposes. The project is actually live now, so I've put a link in the description if you want to check it out, and possibly even contribute to the project yourself.
The final gasps of the Gorgonopsians.
The Gorgonopsians are an extinct group of stem mammals, and arguably one of the most iconic groups of Permian predators that disappeared during the Great Dying, the biggest mass extinction event in our planet's history. But this study suggests that at least one population did manage to barely cling on into the very earliest part of the Triassic period. This is based on a handful of Gorgonopsian skulls found in early Triassic sections of the South African Karoo Basin, and shows that while the group as a whole did still go extinct as a result of the Great Dying, one representative lasted just a little bit longer than previously thought.
Pterosaur nasal passages.
Well-preserved three-dimensional fossils aren't too common, so it's always cool whenever a new one is found. In this case, the skull of a Brazilian pterosaur called Barbosania gracilirostris allowed for a digital reconstruction of its nasal passages and associated sinuses, finding that this pterosaur had a pretty good sense of smell. More interestingly, they also tested to see how different potential placements of the nostrils would have allowed air to flow into the skull during flight as a possible form of thermoregulation to keep the animal's brain cool during the high-energy activity of flight.
Horn injuries in Ceratopsians.
It's been somewhat debated for a while if and how Ceratopsians use their impressive horns for combat. This study will help contribute to the conversation, presenting evidence in the form of broken horn cores in Triceratops, Anchiceratops, and Chasmosaurus that all show similar patterns of damage and healing. The study then compares the injuries seen in these Chasmosaurian ceratopsids to those in Centrosaurians, the other main branch of the horned dinosaur family tree, to see if and how the two groups might have differed in how they use their impressive pointy bits.
Movin Mosasaurs.
Mosasaurs have gotten particularly popular in the past decade, but there's still a lot to be learned about them, including their preferred swimming styles and how fast they could actually move. This study reconstructed and compared the anatomies of a couple different types of mosasaurs to analyze their potential burst capabilities, aka how fast they could accelerate to their top speeds. The results showed that mosasaurs were all capable of high burst speeds, which makes sense for open water predators, though smaller species were much quicker off the mark than the larger ones that were more adapted for efficiently cruising through the ocean, possibly suggesting different hunting strategies across these seagoing lizards.
Skinny dipping Diplodocus.
Skin preservation in extinct dinosaurs is still pretty rare, but reports of it are steadily becoming more common as paleontological techniques improve and scientists grow more aware of what to look for before they start chiseling away at a fossil in an attempt to just get to the bone. This study looked at the bits of skin that had been preserved on the belly region of a young Diplodocus fossil, using a micro CT scanner to examine their inner structure. It turns out that these scales were hollow and porous, which expanded their surface area and would have allowed for heat to transfer from inside the body to the outside environment, either through wind or evaporating water when the animal took a dip in a local river. Because sauropods were large animals that lived in hot, often dry environments, having ways to keep cool would have been essential, and this shows one of these anatomical adaptations.
Nom Nomming and Oldman.
Biogeochemical isotope studies have been a pretty common trend in recent years, since they allow you to get an idea of what kinds of foods animals were eating based on how much of certain elements are present in their bones and teeth. This study applied this technique to a late Cretaceous floodplain ecosystem in Canada, preserved in a rock layer called the Oldman Formation. It found that the local Ceratopsians and Ankylosaurs were eating different kinds of plants from each other, while Hadrosaurs overlapped with both, but still had their own preferred leafy greens that the other two groups probably couldn't reach. Among the carnivores, the local Tyrannosaurs and Dromaeosaurs were both, of course, eating lots of meat, though they had different elements suggesting that they targeted different prey types, which also makes sense. Most interestingly, the Troodontids showed evidence of being omnivores, which is something that's long been hypothesized based on their distinctive tooth shape, but this is the first time, as far as I'm aware, that this has been more or less directly confirmed.
Climate Change, the board game.
Here's another fun and important SciComm project. A group of paleontologists and K-12 educators in Tennessee have collaborated to create a board game to help teach kids about climate change and evolution, two topics that in many parts of the US are still heavily misunderstood, if not outright controversial to actually teach about in public schools. The abstract doesn't really explain how the game itself works, but it reports that feedback from both teachers and students is quite positive, providing an engaging and fun way to understand the complexities of these key forces of life on Earth.
Examining data collection in museums.
Continuing the theme of important but not very flashy work that needs to be done, this study reports on the efforts of the Sternberg Museum in Kansas to overhaul their prep lab's collection data and archival process. Seems trivial, but it's important. You can't just assume that a fossil in a museum is in the same condition as it was when it was first pulled from the ground, and accounting for these changes in your own research isn't easy when you have no record of things like when a fossil was acquired, if and how it got broken and repaired during preparation, or if there are glues or chemical treatments on it, all of which might affect the results of your own study. Hopefully, this report will result in a standard set of protocols that all museums and other fossil housing institutions can use to record and document all of this important information.
Migration patterns in Brea.
The famous Rancho La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, California, have been trapping animals there for the past 50,000 years, among them a number of different types of large herbivores. This study looks at both chemical isotopes and tooth wear patterns of ancient bison, horses, and camels, and combines that data with information on age distribution in these species to figure out their annual migratory patterns. The results show that, contrary to previous thought, bison were year-round residents of the area around Rancho La Brea, while camels and horses were seasonal migrants. It doesn't sound like the most exciting study, but figuring out the movement patterns of extinct animals is always cool to me.
Where's the webbing?
The practice of using specific marks on bones to infer the presence of certain types of soft tissue structures in extinct animals is another increasingly popular trend over the past decade, particularly among the art-focused side of the paleo community. This study looks to add more for folks to think about, presenting a number of features that can be reliably used to determine if an animal has webbed feet or flippers. The abstract doesn't say if they actually applied these techniques to any particular extinct animals, but I can certainly think of a few that could use this treatment.
Minnesota's new state fossil.
Correct me on this if I'm wrong, but the tradition of having a state fossil is one of those American things from the 1980s that I'm not sure exists anywhere else in the world. Despite this, there are still a few states that don't have a state fossil for one reason or another, and last year the folks at the Science Museum of Minnesota decided to change that, putting forward 8 nominations and releasing the options in a public meeting. Turns out that none of these candidates won the vote because the majority of over 11,000 voters decided that they wanted the giant beaver, Castoroides ohioensis, as Minnesota's state fossil. It'll be interesting to see who votes against this motion once the bill is drafted and voted upon by the state legislature. The choosing of state animals can get surprisingly and amusingly heated, but that's a set of stories for another day.
Downsizing Dunkleosteus.
It's always fun when one of these studies comes out that radically changes our understanding of the appearance of an animal, especially one of the popular ones that everyone thinks they know pretty well because it featured in some documentaries from their childhood. Well, if this study holds up, it looks like Dunkleosteus is about to get an interesting new look. The researcher behind this project looked at the common method used to estimate total body length in arthrodires, the group of armored fish that Dunkleosteus belongs to, and found that they don't actually work very well in cases where most, if not all, of the body has been preserved. This is because this method is based on assuming shark-like proportions, when in fact arthrodires are much more stoutly built fish. To remedy this issue, a new calculation method was created based on measurements of a different part of the skull and taking proper arthrodire proportions into account. Applying this new model produces length estimates that better match the sizes seen in complete fossils. Taking this to Dunkleosteus terrelli, which has historically been estimated to reach some 8 meters or 30 feet long based on the largest known fossil specimen, produces a total body length of only about half that size, or 4 to 5 meters, 12 to 16 feet. So prepare for a bunch of chibified Dunkleosteus illustrations in the near future.
Big news about Big Al.
While we're talking about well-known fossil animals, I think it's safe to say that there are few if any individuals that have reached the level of fame as Big Al, the Allosaurus that was the subject of the 2000 BBC special, The Ballad of Big Al. As the documentary shows, Big Al is thought to have been a dinosaur that lived fast and died young, his body riddled with injuries and infections acquired from a short and violent life that barely lasted more than a decade. However, this new study, which looked at cross-sections of the animal's leg bones, turns a lot of this narrative completely on its head. While it's still clear that this dinosaur got banged up a lot, and particularly harsh injuries might have slowed or stunted its growth in certain years, Big Al actually lived to be at least 16 years old, if not more. What's more, it had layers of incompletely resorbed medullary bone, which among other things is commonly understood as a mark of high calcium production that is used in the formation of eggshells. Yes, you heard that right. Big Al was probably female. And unlike her TV counterpart, she fucked. Alright, those are just some of the many studies listed in this book. Like I said, take everything with appropriate levels of caution for now since most of this stuff hasn't been published and peer-reviewed yet, but hopefully you got an idea of the exciting things that paleontologists are working on and why SVP and other paleontology conferences get so much attention every year. I've linked the SVP program guide in the description. There's a lot more in there that I haven't mentioned simply because I didn't get all the way through the book while I was looking for studies to cover. Maybe I'll do a part 2 soon if this video does well enough and that's something you want to see from me. This only took a few days to make, and I could use some more quick material while I continue working on bigger, more in-depth projects that'll be coming out in the next few months. Until then, many thanks, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.